The colossal glass walls of Ethel Technologies' boardroom hummed with a palpable, almost suffocating tension. Inside, the brightest minds in American engineering sat defeated, their gazes fixed on the swirling, indecipherable lines of code projected onto a massive screen, a digital hydra that seemed to grow 2 new eras for everyone they vanquished. At the head of the gleaming mahogany table, Victoria Sterling paced, her stiletto heels clicking on the polished floor like a metronome of doom. She was a vision of power in a crimson suit, a stark slash of color against the room's cool grays and blues, but her face was a mask of cold fury. This project, a revolutionary renewable energy system, was her legacy, and it was failing. Catastrophically. "Months," she said, her voice a low, dangerous growl that cut through the silence. "Months of work, the best equipment money can buy, the highest salaries in the industry. And for what? A $200 million paperweight." Her eyes swept over the team, each person flinching as her gaze landed on them. These were specialists, industry giants, men and women who had built empires of data. Today, they looked like scolded children. "I am tired of excuses. I am tired of theories." She stopped pacing and leaned forward, her palms flat on the table, her crimson sleeves a stark contrast to the dark wood. "Fix this," she declared, her voice dripping with a contempt that was more wounding than any shout. "Fix this and I'll give you $200 million. A bonus, a prize. Call it whatever you want. Just make it work." The offer, meant to be an incentive, landed like a public flogging. It wasn't about the money, it was about the implication that their professional pride, their very expertise, had a price tag, and that it hadn't been enough. Michael Chen, the head of engineering, a man with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of 3 sleepless nights, could only nod, his jaw tight. The injustice of it hung in the air, thick and suffocating. If your heart is also racing at the sheer unfairness of this moment, at the weight of expectation crushing good people, take a second to show some support and like this story. The weight in that room was more than just corporate pressure. It was the crushing burden of collective failure, amplified by the scorn of the one person they were all desperate to impress. But to understand the miracle that was about to unfold in that room of broken code and bruised egos, you have to understand the world just outside its soundproofed glass doors. A world that began, for our purposes, 3 weeks earlier. Just outside those hallowed, hushed confines, David Miller moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had mastered the art of being invisible. In his worn blue janitor's uniform, he was as much a part of the building's infrastructure as the polished chrome fixtures or the silent, motion-activated lights. He pushed his cleaning cart down the gleaming corridor, the gentle squeak of its wheels a familiar, anonymous sound against the hum of servers and the hurried footsteps of tech giants. He was a ghost in a blue uniform, emptying wastebaskets filled with discarded coffee cups and crumpled printouts of failed code, wiping away fingerprints from glass doors that opened into worlds he could never enter. Beside him, a much smaller, quieter presence followed. His 8-year-old daughter, Lily, sat at an unused desk in a quiet alcove, a slightly oversized backpack resting by her feet. This was their after-school routine. While David finished his shift, Lily finished her homework, her world the hushed, sterile expanse of Ethel Technologies after hours. She was a small island of innocence in an ocean of ambition. To the few executives who ever noticed her, she was just a footnote. The janitor's kid, a silent, well-behaved child. They never saw the way her bright, curious eyes followed the glowing lines of code on the monitors she passed, or the way she'd tilt her head, listening to the fragments of frustrated conversations that drifted from conference rooms. For weeks, Lily had been an unnoticed observer of the escalating crisis. She had seen the engineers' faces grow longer, their shoulders slump with exhaustion. She had seen pizza boxes pile up outside the main lab and heard snippets of jargon she didn't understand, but filed away nonetheless. Cascade failure, legacy data corruption, timestamp mismatch. To her, they were just interesting sounds, like words from a foreign language. But Lily's mind was different. It was a clean slate, unburdened by years of ingrained protocols and sophisticated algorithms. While the experts, blinded by their own specialized perspectives, were digging deeper and deeper into the complex new code, Lily was looking at the whole picture. She'd watched them on the big screens in the hallways, pointing at intricate new functions, arguing about recursive loops and validation protocols, but her eyes would drift to the bottom of the screen, to the foundational data streams that scrolled by, the old information that the new system was built upon. She saw something they didn't, a pattern, a tiny, insignificant-looking inconsistency that appeared again and again in the historical records. It was a simple thing, a relic from a system so old it was practically digital dust. "What are you looking at so hard, sweet pea?" David had asked one evening, gently wiping a smudge from her cheek. Lily pointed a small finger toward a distant monitor, displaying scrolling columns of dates and numbers. "Their numbers are fighting, Daddy," she said softly, her brow furrowed in concentration. "The old ones and the new ones. The new ones think the day is the month and the month is the day, so they keep telling the old ones they're wrong." David had smiled, ruffling her hair. It was the kind of adorable, nonsensical observation a child would make. He didn't understand a single thing about the work done in this building. Other than that, it was important and made the people here very stressed. His job was to clean up the messes they left behind, not to understand their creation. He was a good father, a man who worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads after his wife Eleanor had passed away. His world was about scraped knees, multiplication tables, and packing a healthy lunch. It was not about legacy date fields, but Lily kept observing. She saw the mounting frustration, the increasingly frequent visits from a furious-looking Victoria Sterling. She saw the brilliant engineers staring at the same complex sections of the new code, again and again, completely missing the simple flaw in the foundation. It was like they were trying to fix a leaning tower by polishing the windows on the top floor, never thinking to check the ground it was built on. Her innocent mind, free from the tunnel vision of expertise, had pieced together a puzzle the adults couldn't see. The pressure inside Ethel reached a breaking point. The launch was imminent, investors were getting nervous, and Victoria Sterling's formidable composure was beginning to crack. The mood in the building was funereal. David felt it too, a second-hand anxiety that seeped through the walls. He watched his daughter, who was now sketching in her notebook, not her usual doodles of flowers and animals, but diagrams of boxes and arrows with dates written inside them. That evening, as the last of the defeated engineers trudged out for a few hours of fitful sleep, Lily tugged on her father's sleeve. She held up her notebook. On the page was a simple drawing, 2 columns of dates. One read 10/5/2012. An arrow pointed from it to a box labeled Old System. Another arrow pointed from that box to a new one labeled New System. But next to it, the date was interpreted as May 10th. She had drawn a big red X over it. "They told the computer to read it the American way," she whispered, as if sharing a grand secret. "But the old computer was from England. It's not a mistake in the new part, Daddy. It's a mistake in the translation." David stared at the drawing. He didn't understand the specifics, but he understood the conviction in his daughter's eyes. He saw the pure, simple logic of it. He had spent his life being told to stay in his lane, to keep his head down, to not cause trouble. To speak up was to risk everything, his job, his quiet existence, the very stability he fought so hard to provide for Lily. He could be laughed at, humiliated, fired on the spot for interrupting the most important crisis meeting in the company's history with a child's theory. But then he looked at Lily's face, so full of earnest certainty, and a surge of paternal courage he didn't know he possessed washed over him. His daughter saw something no one else could. How could he let that spark be extinguished by his own fear? He took a deep, steadying breath, the fate of a $200 million project, and more importantly, his daughter's fragile spark of genius, resting on the courage behind his next 3 seconds. The rattling rhythm of the northbound train was a world away from the vacuum-sealed silence of Ethel Technologies. Here, inside the fluorescent-lit metal tube hurtling beneath the city, life was a chaotic symphony of screeching brakes, muffled announcements, and the low hum of 100 private conversations. David Miller sat with his back straight, a habit learned from years of trying to take up as little space as possible. His worn janitor's uniform, though clean, felt like a second skin of invisibility. Beside him, Lily was oblivious to the weary commuters packed around them. Her small brow was furrowed in concentration, her pencil scratching furiously across the pages of a worn spiral notebook. She wasn't drawing flowers or houses like other 8-year-olds. She was drawing boxes and arrows, intricate webs of logic that mirrored the diagrams she'd glimpsed on the massive screens in the corridors of power. Their apartment in Queens was small, but it was a sanctuary. The scent of David's microwaved lasagna, their post-shift ritual, filled the air, a humble warmth that stood in defiant contrast to the cold, recycled air of the corporate tower. While David set the table, 2 plates, 2 forks, 2 paper napkins, Lily remained at the small kitchen table, her notebook propped open against the salt shaker. "How was school today, Lilybug?" David asked. His voice soft, tired, but full of a love so vast it seemed to barely fit inside their tiny kitchen. Lily didn't look up immediately. "It was okay. We learned about ancient Rome. Mrs. Davison said they built things to last for thousands of years. They checked everything twice." She finally lifted her gaze, and her eyes, wide and impossibly clear, held a question that seemed far older than she was. "Daddy, why don't the people at your work check their old stuff?" David paused, a plate halfway to the table. He was used to Lily's unusual questions, her mind always connecting dots he couldn't even see. He chose his words carefully, trying to simplify a $200 million crisis. "Well, honey, it's complicated. They have this new system like a brand new car engine, but they had to attach it to a really, really old part, and that old part is making the new engine sick." "Is it a number sickness?" Lily asked, her pencil tapping a staccato rhythm on the page. David chuckled, ruffling her hair. "You could say that. The smartest people in the world, and they can't figure out which number it is." He sat down opposite her, pushing a piece of garlic bread onto her plate. The unspoken weight of his words hung in the air. The smartest people, the richest people, not people like us. His job was to clean up their coffee spills and empty their trash cans, to remain unseen while they wrestled with problems that shaped the world. The irony was a bitter pill he swallowed every single day. If only they knew his daughter's mind was sharper than any of theirs. But to them, she was just the janitor's kid, another piece of invisible furniture. Across the river, in a penthouse apartment that seemed to float among the stars, Victoria Sterling was not eating. She stood before a floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of untouched whiskey in her hand. The glittering expanse of Manhattan spread beneath her like a conquered kingdom. But she felt no triumph. The pressure was a physical weight, a tightening in her chest that had been building for weeks. Her phone buzzed on the marble countertop, the screen illuminating the name of a board member, a man whose patience was measured in fractions of a cent on the stock market. She ignored it. She walked over to a terminal in her home office, the screen glowing with the same venomous scrolling lines of code that haunted her headquarters. This project was supposed to be her legacy, the crowning achievement that would cement Ethel not just as a corporate giant, but as a savior of the planet. Instead, it was threatening to become her public execution. She wasn't just a CEO, she was a symbol. A woman who had shattered every glass ceiling only to find herself trapped in a glass box of her own making. For a fleeting moment, the crimson suit and the iron will melted away, and she was just a woman, terrified of failure, haunted by the ghost of her father, who had always told her she'd have to be twice as good to get half as far. The phone buzzed again, insistent, and with a deep, shuddering breath, Victoria Sterling put her armor back on. The flicker of vulnerability was gone, replaced by the cold, hard glint of resolve. She would fix this. She would burn the whole system to the ground and rebuild it from ash if she had to. She just needed to find the source of the fire. Back in Queens, Lily was finishing her homework. David watched her, his heart swelling with a fierce, protective pride. She organized her pencils by color, her papers into neat stacks. She found order in everything. He saw the way she watched the world, not just looking, but seeing. He'd seen her notice a loose tile on the subway platform that dozens of engineers probably walked over every day. He'd seen her figure out why their toaster only worked if you jiggled the lever a certain way. Her brain was a beautiful, intricate machine for solving puzzles. And for weeks, The biggest puzzle in her life had been the hushed, frantic whispers and the cascading red error messages at Ethel Technologies. She had filled pages of her notebook with snippets of conversations she'd overheard. The validation fails on historical data. It's something in the legacy migration. It's like it's from another country, reading the dates all wrong. The phrases meant little to the adults who'd uttered them, lost in a forest of complexity. But to Lily, they were breadcrumbs. Later that night, long after David thought she was asleep, Lily crept out of her small bedroom. In the quiet glow of the kitchen's nightlight, she retrieved her notebook. She sat on the cool linoleum floor, flipping through the pages. Then she stopped. Her eyes were fixed on something she'd scribbled in the margin a week ago, a passing thought she'd almost forgotten. It was a date she had seen on one of the screens, 10/5/2012. Beside it, she had drawn a little question mark. She padded over to the refrigerator, where an old promotional calendar from a local pizzeria was held up by a magnet. The month at the top read October. Her small finger traced the numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. October 5th. Her eyes darted back to the numbers in her notebook. 10:05. In America, that meant the 10th month, the 5th day, October 5th. But then, another overheard whisper surfaced in her memory from one of the programmers who had a British accent. "It's bloody backwards, like the way my mum writes the date." Lily's breath hitched. What if the old system wasn't from America? What if it was from somewhere else? A place where 10:05 didn't mean October 5th. A place where it meant the 10th day of the 5th month, May 10th. It was so simple, so profoundly, ridiculously simple. It wasn't a complex algorithmic flaw, it wasn't a malicious bug. It was a translation error, a misplaced number, a single overlooked line of code, inherited from the distant past, that was telling the brand new engine that winter was summer and spring was fall. A fundamental misunderstanding that was causing the entire $200 billion structure to tear itself apart. In the silent kitchen, bathed in the faint city glow filtering through the window, Lily Miller's world snapped into sharp, sudden focus. She saw the whole thing, a perfect, clear picture in her mind. She saw the problem, and more importantly, for the very first time, she saw the solution. The weight of this knowledge, huge and terrifying and electrifying, settled into her small chest. The smartest people in the world were looking for a monster in the dark, but she had just realized it was only a shadow, cast by a light switch that no one had thought to flip. The pressure inside Ethel Technologies had curdled from a low hum into a suffocating, high-pitched scream that only Victoria Sterling seemed to hear. For 2 days she had maintained a facade of unbreakable control, her crimson suit a shield against the creeping chaos. But now, alone for a fleeting moment as her team took a mandated 15-minute break, the shield began to crack. She leaned against the cool floor-to-ceiling window of the boardroom, her forehead pressed against the glass, ignoring the dizzying view of New York City sprawling below. Her reflection stared back, a woman she barely recognized, the sharp lines of her face softened by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. They had tried everything. They had thrown algorithms at the problem, brute-forced solutions, and rewritten entire modules until the code was a Frankenstein's monster of failed attempts. Yet the digital hydra remained, growing 2 new errors for every one they severed. The $200 million bounty, once a display of power, now felt like an anchor, a public declaration of her own failure. A sharp rap on the glass of the adjoining conference room made her flinch. Michael Chen stood there, his eyes bloodshot, holding up a tablet with another stream of red error messages. Victoria simply shook her head, a gesture of pure defeat, and waved him away. Outside, in the hushed cathedral-like corridor, David Miller was emptying the last of the trash receptacles. He worked with a quiet efficiency, born of years of practice, his movements economical and almost silent. Beside him, perched on the edge of a minimalist leather bench, Lily was sketching in a small, worn notebook. She wasn't drawing flowers or houses, she was drawing flowcharts, boxes connected by arrows, with little notes scribbled in the margins. For the past hour, David had watched her, a knot of something unidentifiable tightening in his chest. It was a mix of pride, fear, and a bewildering sense of hope. He had overheard the whispers, the hushed, frantic conversations from the executives passing by. He'd seen the despair on the face of Michael Chen, a man who usually walked the halls with an air of unshakable confidence, and he had listened, truly listened to Lily. Half an hour earlier, she had tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy," she had said, her voice soft but certain, "I think they're looking in the wrong place." She had explained it to him then, in simple terms that even he could grasp, using an analogy about a library where all the books were shelved by the wrong date. She spoke of a legacy field, a term she must have picked up from the fragments of conversation she'd absorbed. She explained how an old system might have written the 10th of May as 10/5, but a new system was reading it as the 5th of October. It was a simple inversion, a tiny mistake buried in the foundation, causing the entire skyscraper of new code to tremble and crack. He had stared at her, at this small, brilliant person who was his whole world, and he believed her. The conviction in her eyes was as clear and steady as a beacon. And now, seeing the utter defeat in the posture of Victoria Sterling through the glass, a wild, terrifying courage began to bloom in David's heart. It was a father's courage, fierce and irrational, a force that could make a man who spent his life being invisible decide to step into the brightest, harshest light. He looked at Lily, who gave him a small, trusting nod. That was all it took. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Each step he took toward the boardroom felt like wading through molasses. The plush carpeting seemed to grab at the worn soles of his shoes. He passed Victoria's executive assistant, a young woman named Clara with a headset permanently attached to her ear and an expression of perpetual stress. She looked up, her eyes widening in a mixture of confusion and annoyance. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone implying that he was clearly lost. Her gaze flickered down to his uniform, then back to his face, a silent, swift dismissal. I need to speak with Miss Sterling," David managed, his voice sounding thin and unfamiliar to his own ears. Clara's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched. "Ms. Sterling is in a critical meeting. She is not to be disturbed." The finality in her voice was a steel door slamming shut. For a second, David's courage wavered. This was their world, a world of locked doors and unwritten rules where men like him were part of the scenery, not part of the conversation. But then he glanced back at Lily, who had stood up and was watching him, her small face a portrait of unwavering faith. He took a deep breath, the sterile, air-conditioned air doing little to calm his racing pulse. "It's about the system failure," David said, his voice a little stronger now. My daughter. She thinks she knows what's wrong." Clara's expression shifted from annoyance to outright disbelief. She almost laughed, a short, sharp huff of air. "Look, I appreciate whatever this is, but we have the top engineers in the country working on this. We don't have time for—" She trailed off, searching for a word that wasn't a direct insult. "Please," David insisted, his voice raw with an earnestness that was impossible to fake. "Just 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking." It was at that moment that the boardroom door slid open and Victoria Sterling stepped out, her face a mask of cold fury. She was about to reprimand Michael Chen for something when her eyes landed on the scene, her flustered assistant and the company janitor, who seemed to be refusing to leave. "What is going on here, Clara?" Victoria's voice was dangerously low, each word clipped and sharp. "I'm sorry, Ms. Sterling," Clara began, flustered. "This man was just leaving. He was—" "I need 5 minutes of your time," David interrupted, speaking directly to Victoria, his gaze steady despite the tremor in his hands. He knew this was it, the point of no return. He would either be heard or be fired, possibly both. Victoria Sterling stared at David Miller, as if he were a strange species of insect that had crawled into her pristine office. Contempt warred with a sliver of morbid curiosity on her face. Her first instinct was to have security escort him out. It was the efficient, logical thing to do. But then she looked past him and saw Lily standing a few feet away, a small, solitary figure in the cavernous hallway, clutching her notebook. There was something in the child's composure, in her quiet intensity, that gave Victoria pause. They were desperate. They were out of options. Every single one of her $200,000 a year experts had failed her. What was the harm in 5 minutes of madness? It would at the very least be a brief, absurd distraction from the ongoing catastrophe. 5 minutes, Victoria said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She turned and swept back into the boardroom without a second glance, leaving the door open in a silent, impatient command. The engineers, who had just started to file back in, stopped and stared as David Miller, the man who cleaned their coffee spills and emptied their trash, walked into the most important room in the company. David gently took Lily's hand, his own rough and calloused against her small, smooth one. Together they crossed the threshold. The silence that fell upon the room was absolute. It was heavier and more profound than the tense silence of failure that had preceded it. 20 of the brightest minds in American engineering, men and women who commanded massive salaries and global respect, swiveled in their ergonomic chairs to stare at the janitor and his little girl. The air was thick with skepticism and a palpable sense of the absurd. David felt 100 invisible judgments pressing down on him, threatening to crush his resolve. But Lily's hand in his was a steady anchor. She seemed unfazed by the intimidating setting or the powerful people staring at her. Her focus was singular. Her eyes scanned the massive wraparound screen at the front of the room, which still displayed the cascading lines of fatal error codes. She saw not chaos, but a question waiting for its simple answer. Victoria Sterling gestured impatiently toward the front of the room with a flick of her wrist. "You have 4 minutes left," she said, her voice dripping with ice. Lily let go of her father's hand, walked calmly to the digital whiteboard, and picked up a black stylus marker. The entire room held its breath, a collective pause of disbelief. As the small girl in the slightly too large sweater turned to face them, her expression one of serene, unshakable clarity. The silence in the Ethel Technologies boardroom was a physical entity, heavy and suffocating. It pressed in on David Miller, making the worn collar of his blue uniform feel impossibly tight. Every eye in the room, belonging to minds worth a collective fortune, was fixed on his daughter. Lily stood before the vast glowing expanse of the digital whiteboard, a small still figure in a world of frantic high-stakes motion. Her worn sneakers seemed impossibly fragile on the polished obsidian floor. Victoria Sterling, perched at the head of the mahogany table, watched with an expression of thinly veiled, desperate skepticism. Her crimson suit was a slash of violent color in the cool, sterile environment, a perfect reflection of the storm raging inside her. The 5 minutes she had granted felt like a lifetime of foolishness she was about to endure. Lily did not seem to notice the weight of their scrutiny. She reached up, and with a dry erase stylus that looked like a scepter in her small hand, she began to draw. She didn't write complex code. She drew a simple timeline, a single elegant line stretching across the white surface. With a child's unerring simplicity, she spoke, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the dense silence like a bell. "The problem isn't here," she said, pointing a small finger at a complex algorithm displayed on a nearby monitor. "It's way back here." Her finger tapped the beginning of her timeline. "In the old data, when the company first started." A low murmur rippled through the assembled engineers. Michael Chen, his face a gray mask of exhaustion, leaned forward, his elbows on the table. He had spent 72 sleepless hours staring at that very algorithm. Lily continued, her focus absolute. "When you brought the old records into the new system, something got turned around. In America, you write the month first, then the day. 10/5 is October 5th. But the old system, the one from the very first international partner, it was from a place where they write the day first. So 10/5 was being read as May 10th. She drew 2 simple date formats on the board, MMDD-YYYY and DDMM-YYY. The contrast was stark, almost insultingly obvious. Every time the new system checks a historical energy patent or a legacy contract from before the migration, Lily explained, her voice unwavering, it sees a date that doesn't make sense with the events it's supposed to validate. It's a 5-month difference, so it rejects it. And the next one, and the next one. It's not one big bug. It's thousands and thousands of tiny little rejections happening every second, creating a cascade failure. The system is trying to build a house, but every single brick you give it, is the wrong shape. Victoria Sterling stared, her perfectly composed features slowly dissolving. The contempt, the sharp-edged impatience was being eroded by a rising tide of dawning, horrifying comprehension. It was elegant, it was simple, it was so fundamental, so deeply embedded in the very bedrock of their data that her entire team of forward-looking specialists had soared right over it, searching for complex monsters in the clouds, while the true problem was a simple crack in the foundation beneath their feet. Michael Chen stood up so abruptly, his chair scraped against the floor. He walked to the whiteboard, his eyes wide, tracing Lily's simple diagram with a trembling finger. He looked from her drawing to the streams of error logs on the main screen, and a choked sound escaped his throat. It was the sound of a man who had been lost in a blizzard, suddenly seeing the light of a warm house just a few feet away. "It's the legacy date field," he whispered, the words filled with a kind of terrible reverence. He looked at Lily, his gaze a mixture of awe and profound shame. "The historical data parser. We never thought to revalidate its source formatting. We just assumed." He turned to Victoria, his face pale. "She's right. It's possible. It's probable." Victoria's gaze shifted from Michael to the small girl who stood calmly by the board. She didn't look triumphant. She simply looked as if she had stated a fact, like explaining that the sky was blue. And in that moment, Victoria Sterling felt a blush of heat spread across her face. A deep, honest shame that felt hotter than any furnace. The $200 million problem, solved by a child who had been doing her homework in the hallway, a child she had never once noticed, whose father she only recognized as a fleeting shape in a blue uniform. "Fix it," Victoria commanded, her voice no longer sharp, but a strained, quiet rasp. The room erupted into a controlled frenzy. Michael Chen was at the main console, his fingers flying across the holographic keyboard. He wasn't writing new code. He was navigating deep into the system's core configuration files to a place no one had looked in years. He isolated the legacy data import module. The room held its breath, a collective lungful of stale, anxious air. David Miller stood frozen by the door, his hand resting protectively on Lily's shoulder, his heart hammering against his ribs in a frantic, wild rhythm. Michael located the single line of code responsible for interpreting the date format. With a few keystrokes, he inverted the validation protocol. DDMM became MMDD. He initiated a system-wide recompilation. On the massive screens, the chaotic waterfall of red error messages ceased. For 3 agonizing seconds, there was nothing but black. Then, one by one, diagnostic lights began to flare. Green, green, a whole panel of them, glowing with the beautiful, steady light of success. The historical data, once a maelstrom of rejected validations, began to process, flowing across the screen in smooth, perfect, orderly lines. A profound, breathless silence fell once more. It was broken by a single, ragged sob of relief from one of the junior engineers. Then the room exploded into applause. It wasn't just relief. It was a release of weeks of tension, failure, and humiliation. But Victoria Sterling was not applauding. She was standing, her eyes locked on Lily and David. When the noise subsided, Victoria walked to the front of the room, standing beside the small girl who had just saved her company. The crimson of her suit no longer seemed like armor, but like a vulnerability, the color of a bleeding heart. "I made an offer earlier today," she began, her voice clear and strong, resonating with a newfound humility that stunned her team into silence. $200 million to the person who fixed this. Lily Miller fixed this. She turned to face David, her eyes filled with an emotion he had never expected to see from her. Respect. "Mr. Miller, I'm keeping my word, but giving a check to a child feels insufficient. Instead, with your permission, Ethel Technologies will be establishing an educational trust fund in Lily's name for the full amount of $200 million. It will ensure she has access to any school, any university, any resource she ever needs to nurture this extraordinary mind." Tears welled in David's eyes, and he could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. "But that is not enough," Victoria continued, her gaze sweeping across her team, forcing them to see what she now saw. "This isn't about one lucky guess. This is about a systemic failure on our part. We failed to see. We failed to listen to anyone outside our own echo chamber. Her eyes landed on Lily again. I understand Lily's mother, Eleanor, is no longer with us. In her honor, we will be creating the Eleanor Miller Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing scholarships, mentorship, and support to brilliant, underprivileged students across this nation. We will ensure that no talent like this is ever lost in the shadows again, simply because we weren't looking in the right places. The room was utterly still, the air charged with the gravity of her words. Many of the engineers, moments before celebrating a technical victory, now lowered their heads, moved and shamed in equal measure. "And Mr. Miller," Victoria said, her voice softening, "a man of your integrity, who raised a daughter like this, you do not belong on the periphery. We have a place for you. I am creating a new position for you, as a senior liaison in our infrastructure and logistics department, a position of trust and responsibility. We need your perspective. We need to be reminded, every day, of the people who make this place truly run." Finally, she knelt, bringing herself down to Lily's level. The powerful CEO of Ethel Technologies was on her knees before the janitor's daughter. "And Lily," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "we are creating a new youth advisory council. I don't want this to be a one-time thing. I want your voice and voices like yours, helping us see the things we are blind to. Not as a symbol, not as charity, but because we have now learned, in the most profound way possible, that it is an absolute necessity for our survival." She stood up and looked at her stunned team, at the green light still glowing on the monitors, at the man and his daughter who had just recalibrated the moral compass of her entire world. The invisible had not only become visible, they had become essential. Their value, once ignored, was now the undeniable foundational truth upon which the company's future would be rebuilt. The room was no longer just a boardroom. It was a sanctuary of humbling, painful, and glorious redemption. The hum that coursed through the veins of Ethel Technologies 3 months later was different. The frantic, high-strung thrum of anxiety had been replaced by a calmer, more purposeful rhythm, like a heart that had survived a great shock and was now beating stronger, more deliberately. The reverberations of Lily Miller's revelation had not been a momentary tremor. They had been a seismic event fundamentally reshaping the company's landscape. David Miller now walked these gleaming corridors, not with the invisibility of a janitor, but with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his worth had finally been seen. His new title was Director of Infrastructural Integrity, a role Victoria Sterling had created for him. It was more than a title, it was a statement. He was no longer just cleaning the surfaces. He was responsible for the building's very bones, a responsibility he took with the same meticulous care he had once applied to its floors. His office wasn't on the executive floor by his own request. It was a modest, functional space on a lower level, its single window looking out over the service entrance he knew so well. It kept him grounded. Michael Chen, the head of engineering who had once barely registered David's existence, now visited him weekly. He wouldn't just ask about server room temperatures, he'd ask about the subtle vibrations David might have felt in the West Wing, or the strange hum he'd heard coming from the primary generator. David's years of unnoticed observation had given him an intuitive understanding of the building's language, a knowledge that no engineering degree could replicate. "You hear things we don't, David," Michael had said one afternoon, a deep respect in his voice. "We were so busy looking at the screens, we forgot to listen to the machine itself." David had simply nodded, understanding that Michael was talking about more than just the building. The true transformation, however, was most visible in Victoria Sterling. The crimson power suits were still part of her wardrobe, but the armor of arrogance she wore with them was gone. She still commanded a room with her presence, but now she did so by creating space for others, not by consuming all the air within it. Her most significant project was not a new energy grid, but the Eleanor Miller Foundation. She had poured not just $200 million into it, but her own time, her own reputation. The Foundation's mission was simple and devastatingly profound: to find the lilies of the world before they had to save a multi-billion-dollar company to be noticed. It provided scholarships, sponsored mentorships, and ran outreach programs in underserved communities. actively searching for brilliant young minds hidden in the shadows of socio-economic disparity. Victoria often spoke at their events, and her speeches were raw, honest, and stripped of corporate jargon. She spoke of the cost of her own blindness, of the corporate culture that celebrated pedigree over potential, and of the janitor's daughter who had taught her the true meaning of vision. Tears often welled in the eyes of her audience, and sometimes in her own. Lily Miller, meanwhile, was flourishing. The educational fund was a safety net, but her spirit was the engine. She was enrolled in a specialized STEM academy, a place where her boundless curiosity was not just tolerated but celebrated. Yet, her most impactful classroom was the one she entered once a month at Ethel Technologies. Victoria had made good on her promise, establishing a youth advisory council, and Lily was its inaugural chair. It wasn't a symbolic gesture. In a sunlit conference room designed for collaboration, not intimidation, Lily and a dozen other bright students from across the city would present their ideas to Victoria and her top executives. At the first meeting, Lily, standing on a small stool to be seen over the podium, presented a simple but brilliant proposal. She had cross-referenced the city's public school schedules with Ethel's energy consumption data, suggesting a micro-adjustment to the grid's output during school dismissal times when thousands of homes simultaneously powered up. It was a minor tweak the engineers had overlooked, one that would save a small fortune and reduce system strain. Victoria listened with an intensity that silenced the room, taking notes, asking clarifying questions. She wasn't indulging a child. She was consulting an expert. That day, watching his daughter hold her own among the city's most powerful executives, David felt a wave of emotion so profound it nearly took his breath away. He saw his late wife, Eleanor, in Lily's quiet confidence, in her unshakable belief that a problem was simply a solution waiting to be found. Eleanor had always believed in seeing the value in people others discarded. The foundation named in her honor was not just a memorial, it was the manifestation of her entire life's philosophy. David's new role wasn't just a job, it was a platform to practice the dignity his wife had always preached. He made a point to learn the names of every member of the cleaning and maintenance staff, to sit with them in the break room, to listen to their concerns not as their boss, but as someone who had walked in their shoes. He knew the next Lily Miller might not be a prodigy who could debug a system, but a security guard with an idea for better workflow, or a cafeteria worker who noticed a pattern of waste. And now at Ethel, there was finally a system in place to listen. The revamped renewable energy system, now named the Lily Grid, launched to global acclaim. It was hailed as a triumph of innovation, a paradigm shift in sustainable power distribution. Ethel's stock soared, and Victoria Sterling was featured on the cover of magazines, lauded as a visionary leader. But inside the glass tower, everyone knew the real story. The success of the product was merely a symptom of a much deeper healing. The real triumph was in the small daily interactions, engineers from different departments sharing a coffee and an idea, executives greeting security guards by name, and the shared, unspoken understanding that the best ideas could come from anywhere. The culture of cutthroat competition had given way to one of humble collaboration. They had learned to scrutinize the foundations before patching the cracks. One evening, months after the launch, David found Lily in his office, staring out the window at the sprawling city, a tapestry of glittering lights. She had been at a council meeting and had waited for him to finish his work. "All those lights," she said softly, her small finger tracing a path on the glass. "They're all connected. If one part is wrong, it can make everything else weaker." David came and stood behind her, placing his hands on her shoulders. He looked out at the same view he had seen for years from the other side, as an invisible man mopping floors in the dead of night. The building no longer felt like a monument to a world that excluded him. It felt like home. It felt like a promise. "You made them stronger, sweetie," he whispered, his voice thick with pride. Lily leaned her head back against him, a comfortable silence settling between them. She hadn't just fixed a bug in a machine. She had found a bug in the way people saw each other, and with the simple, fearless clarity of a child, she had shown them all how to fix it. The greatest innovation to ever come out of Ethel Technologies wasn't a product they could sell. It was a lesson in humility they had learned. a moral compass recalibrated, reminding them that true progress is born not when we have all the answers, but when we have the grace to listen to the one person who has the one we need.